All right, Richard. So thank you so much for being here with us for this Q&A and taking the time to answer some questions about your really fantastic lecture that we hope everyone listening out there really enjoyed. My first question is really just a clarificatory question more than anything, and it has to do with the sort of numbers of uploads per days and the number of COVID stories. So if I recall from your talk, I wrote down, you say there are 250,000 uploads per day, and you were analyzing 2,000 COVID stories from March 2020 to February 2021. And I found that those number breakdowns a little surprising because as I was listening to it, not knowing a lot about Wattpad, I'm thinking, well, COVID was by far and away the story in the Anglophone world during that period. And yet only really a tiny fraction of the content on Wattpad is even touching on COVID. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe just clarify, maybe I'm missing something in the stats, or if you could clarify, how that sort of informs your analysis at all.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to pick up on. And I think it requires more of a clarification. It gets into another complicated issue when one does research on the internet. So that 250K number is what Wattpad reports. And what you can see on Wattpad is highly controlled, both algorithmically and also just manually, what the website will let you see. And so when we scrape the website, when we write an automated computer process to gather data from the Wattpad, we can only get data based on what they're showing. Okay. And what they're showing is probably about 2% of what exists on the website. So they say 250,000 stories per day. We're only able to see maybe about 5% of that. And so what we were able to get is about 2,000 COVID stories over a 12-month period. Probably in reality, there are probably maybe 2 million or like a million actual COVID stories. But it's a really good thing you picked up on because some websites like Twitter, when you do a scrape, you can kind of see everything that is posted. But Wattpad, even though it's a user-generated website, it's extremely curated what you can see. And internet researchers, sociologists, political scientists like Chris Bail, Matt Sogolnik, they talk about this algorithmic confounding thing. And there are clever ways that you can get around that problem. There's no really getting around that problem, but there's ways to do like sampling estimations to see that, to just sort of estimate what probably exists in reality versus what you can actually get.
Got it. Thanks a lot.
So this is fine, Richard, and it's obviously there's a huge amount of technical fireworks that's going on behind the scenes here. So thank you for hiding that from us. So I wanted to ask a sort of really big picture question, and this is something that's coming up in our lectures as a way to think about doing cultural analytics work, which is, what is your research question? Or maybe you don't have one, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about that idea of a way of organizing your project, or thinking about these things in terms of this research question. Something comes out of the sciences, but yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Great question. And this is a good reminder to mention that this work was done with two collaborators, Hoyt Long, my friend collaborator at the University of Chicago, and Caitlin Todd, my graduate student at McGill. So shout out to them. I mentioned them at the end of the lecture, but just want to underscore their contributions. Yeah, it's funny. I think in the lecture, early on, I presented as a series of problems, or I think I call them research problems, which I think is how humanists tend to think about projects, like the problem. But yeah, I think research question is another excellent way to frame this. I guess in terms of being really clear about what the research question guiding this work, and then how it was a lens to get into the actual research, there's a very specific question we had, and then a very broad question. The very specific question is, we want to know, how do ordinary people use the affordances of user-generated content, the internet, to internalize and then narrativize a profound social experience or crisis, where COVID is just one example. Black Lives Matter, climate change, those are other major events in society. And we just found that the standard ways the standard material and the standard methods to understand that were, if not inadequate, feel inadequate in terms of all the new material and data available on the internet. So our hypothesis is that it would be different, that the usual way of internalizing and narrativizing major social change, social crisis are like novels, movies, but it's always retrospective and there's lots of gatekeeping involved. And the question is, how does this new technological platform enable new ways, or just ways in general, to tell a story about an event? The big research question that I'm sort of obsessed with, and Simon, you and I talk about this a lot, is a simple observation that at least in first world countries like North America, places like North America, people spend a lot of time on their computers, the internet. We probably spend more time writing and reading things on the internet than doing anything else, including sleeping. The problem is from a scientific or humanist perspective, we don't really know a lot about that. It's a relatively novel form of behavior, and social science, we have great accounts of human behavior in many other different ways, like economics, political science, but just the simple process of writing and reading things, which is, again, what we spend most of our time doing these days, we know very little about. And so this project was a way into that very, very broad research question, just thinking about, take something that people really care about, COVID, and how are they writing and reading and telling stories about that, that thing.
I mean, if I may just briefly, Richard, I'm thinking, you know, before you switched on this project, what were the answers that people in the humanities were giving? I mean, that's maybe one way into a research question. Like if you just, you know, rang up, you know, I don't know, Judith Butler and said, how would people do this? You know, were there pre-existing answers that you felt that you were confronting, or was this like a, you know, voyage into the unknown?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We touch upon it a little bit in the lecture. But yeah, so scholars, well, first, people have been writing about plagues and pandemics for a very, very long time. So one of my favorite books, The Plague by Camus, like I love that novel. And so there's, as you would expect, there are a ton of theories and works of criticism that parse these stories. And that's excellent. But we were a bit unsatisfied because usually these stories, or almost always, are retrospective. They're acts of memorialization. They're kind of reflections on memory. So people usually write stories after the thing has taken place. And that can produce a really interesting account of a major event. And that's just how history works. That's how culture usually works, and so forth. But it's not so much an account of behavior as it's an account of cultural representation. And so, as you know, humanists spend, one of the bedrocks of literary criticism is the critique of representation. How do you represent an event? And you know, we focus on a small number of excellent writers who do a really interesting job of representing artistically events. But we just suddenly have this entire new corpus of material where people are writing stories and representing in real time what we call ad hoc and medias res. And to us, it's a closer form of behavior because something is instantaneously happening. You hear about COVID, or you read about something about COVID, and you have an account that's relatively instant. You can put it on the internet. And that, to me, is just fundamentally different than like Camus' The Plague. Mainly in that critics have focused on this kind of formula for like pandemic stories. So this movie Contagion, right, with Matt Damon and so forth, really great movie. And there's kind of a structure, there's a narrative plot, but that's not really how ordinary humans think about events and so forth. When they're processing something, it's much more instantaneous, immediate. You don't know how the story is going to end. So there's no plot arc per se. There's just stuff happening and you're trying to make sense of it. So yeah.
That's yeah.
So coming off of that, you know, you talk about the sort of unique way in which people are sort of processing the pandemic and kinds of narratives that generated. And one of the points from your lecture that I found most interesting was this idea that that the stories were lonelier, right? And there was this measure of, I think it was sujet, right? Where you have measures of actually the connectivity of characters within the story. And there's a kind of striking lack of these sort of connected graphs of characters talking to each other in these pandemic narratives that people are producing, as compared to your average narrative, and probably as compared to, a movie like Contagion, right? Where all the characters are sort of interacting with each other. And that's not what the pandemic was like for people. So that's really fascinating. But I wanted to push you just a little bit in terms of actually taking us under the hood just a little bit to talk a little bit about how you actually measured that, right? Because for me, I'm just wondering, like, is that something you can do with automated tools, or is that something where at this point, okay, you're actually going into a COVID story and sort of charting out which characters are talking to each other and what the sort of social graph of the narrative looks like in a much more sort of pen and paper kind of way? I would consider both, computational humanities, right? You can do computation with a pen and paper, right? But I'm just curious what kinds of tools you're using, how that process worked. I think the level of detail you gave in the lecture was exactly the right one, but now in the Q&A, I'm just sort of asking for more.
Thanks. This is, I've been looking forward for a chance to talk about the actual modeling. So first we wrote an automated algorithm to compute the sociality measurement. The first thing I want to say about that is, like, why not hire humans to do this? I just want to mention that a simple experiment that my colleague and I, Andrew Piper, did a couple of years ago is we asked 2 humans to just tell us how many people are in this short story. And our inter-annotation agreement was often around 60 to 70%. So the idea of hiring humans to, we think of that as the most reliable way to identify information in the story. It's actually very unreliable. If you're looking for agreement, just humans tend to see very different things in stories. But it's a really simple task of asking how many people are in a story. You will rarely get an agreement. Just to kind of anticipate, I think a possible, reflex to say like you shouldn't get a computer, you use a computer. Like, actually, like, humans are very unreliable, just identifying things in stories. So that's why we tend to use automated processes, because it's more consistent. There's a consistent baseline. So we use a really simple approach. There's been a lot of work by a colleague, David Banman at Berkeley, doing extremely complex work around social networks in stories. And he has very complex algorithms that detect, like, the flow of information between different characters and stories. We're not doing anything remotely that complicated. He's writing more for a kind of CS audience. But the way that we did it is very simple. We arbitrarily identify the length of what we would consider a scene in a story, which for us was relatively short because these are relatively short stories. These are not like novels. So I think for David's work on the traditional novel, it's plus or minus 3 sentences, which is like a paragraph and a half. We shortened it because Wattpad stories on average are much shorter than like Charles Dickens. So that's super arbitrary and you can change that, but that's our definition of a scene. And all we did is if a character is in a scene with another character, we say, and they are appearing not in dialogue, so they're not being spoken about, but they actually are appearing in the scene, in the real actual space of the scene and not being talked about in dialogue, then we basically say they are socially connected in some way. And this can also account for talking through Zoom. So if a character is talking to another character via Zoom, like through their computer, the algorithm will identify that as a social interaction. And then we build the graph by, it's just pairwise, like every time characters, then we weight that interaction by the number of times that happens. And you can just build a social graph, a network graph from that. Yeah.
And so you're looking for within a set unit length of text, basically the co-appearance of character names.
Yeah. Right.
Great.
But also the processing that we do does we call co-reference resolution. So it's not just the character names, but it resolves every mention of he, she, or his to the character, right? So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's a package called Book NLP that does that character co-reference resolution. And then after that, then we can do all of the matching of the characters appearing with each other. I just want to mention a caveat just to anticipate. I feel that before I started getting into this work, I always was kind of horrified by algorithmic detection of complex things in text. And I would say that this is deliberately relatively coarse, but it actually works well. We did some human validation. And we wanted to pick a parsimonious, simple approach. Complex models can often just create more noise in the data. So I would say that it's not a perfect model, but it's pretty good. And the goal is always to make a better model to measure this thing. But I think, for a lot of humanists, there's an attachment to the complexity of the text. And we do these processes to extract patterns, but often in relatively coarse ways.
Great, that's very cool. And I think it emphasizes nicely for students in this course, that you're doing very original research in a lot of ways, because the questions you're asking from a humanistic perspective are so interesting. But there are tools that I'm sure you're modifying in ways that are specific to your project. But there are tools out there that you can go and build off of. You don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel in order to do sort of really cool computational work to help you answer these research questions that really have a core sort of humanistic foundation. So I think that's great.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, this is really fun. I want to sort of spin this around, right, and say one of the things I really appreciated was your shout out to the cognitive scientists in the world. And I can, even in a use of a term like affordances, right? I mean, there's a psychological as well as a, let's say, critique of representational approach going on. So one thing I found really fun in your talk, which you summarize as lonely people write lonely stories, right? Which you talked about. So this seems to be a case where I don't want to say deterministic, right? But it's like the affordances people are using, like, are they commenting? Are they interacting with others? Is somehow related to the kinds of stories they're telling. And I don't know, like, what's the relationship there? I mean, is this, as a scientist, is this a hidden common cause? Is this the fact that they're not engaging with others means that the kinds of stories they're telling are solitary? Can you, I mean, I'm happy for you to speculate. I won't hold you to it, but what's going on there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would say all we have is a correlation and a very statistically significant prediction. No account of causality, so much more work would have to be done, of course. But I would say, now to speculate, because the statistical signal is so strong, we feel that it's real that, users who prefer to imagine a kind of social world where there's not a lot of human connectivity, again, the predictive modeling, the statistical model really is clear that they also tend not to, invite comments or receive comments from other users. They're relatively isolated, or at least the story that they were in produces a kind of social effect that we would consider a form of isolation. And on the other hand, people that tend to write stories that have a lot of social activity, etc., are pretty engaged with other users. Seems almost intuitive, but it is surprising in a way that the way we write and tell stories is either a reflection or a motivator in terms of how we actually behave, at least in real life, as mediated by the internet. I don't know, I would love to actually read more into the CogSci research about, I know there's a lot of research on like loneliness, contagion, stuff like that via the internet, but I think the novelty of this discovery is really thinking about the creative act of writing itself, of how the kind of world that you imagine for yourself in terms of storytelling. I don't think we have good accounts of that in any literature that exists. The behavioral relationship between, again, your expressive capacities, the kind of world making you do, and how you interact with other humans, whether on the internet or in real life.
I think there's a follow-up that's on my mind as well, and you're, let's say, study creativity at scale, sense making at scale, storytelling at scale, and it reminds me a little bit of what the historians used to call history from below, right? That we were no longer going to tell these, great man of history stories. So, would this be, literature from below? I mean, these are, let's say, non-elites, they're ordinary people like you and I, right? Is this, what bearing, for example, would this have on a great man, great woman theorist, working, let's say, in a more familiar mode, writing about Virginia Woolf? Is there any interaction between these two? Are you guys on opposite sides? Are you at an orthogonal axis? What's the relationship between this and some of the styles we've seen before?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that I want to do that we probably won't do just because the piece now is like 50 pages, but I wanted to actually just take some great man, great woman pandemic stories, the plague in translation, and just literally use our model and predict on individual texts of interest and just kind of see where they fall on a kind
just
of.
Put the dot. I guess you could do it. You just put you put a couple dots, and the dots are just bigger and more fancier, but they're dots on the same plane, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. Then you kind of see where they fall. Right. I'd be really interested in knowing. There's a cool project to be done in 5 years, which is when we have a bunch of mainstream cultural artifacts, movies, TV shows about COVID. 5 years from now, we can see, what kinds of Wattpad stories anticipate or predict those, stories and so forth. So you can work historically to see, how well do they predict retrospectively, but in 5 years, we can kind of revisit these models. That's also why I think it's so important to gather this data while it's happening and do these studies so we have a record, because Wattpad's so crazy, they're constantly deleting data and so forth. So the scraping that we do now will be impossible 3 years from now. So I think another kind of bee in my bonnet in terms of data collection, we constantly need to be scraping data as it's before corporations erase it later. But yeah, there's a big question about the relationship between elite cultural production and this kind of cultural production and their relationship. Just one other thing I want to say, based on some other work I've been doing on Black Lives Matter stories on Wattpad versus contemporary fiction, like Colson Whitehead, is, I have crazy curves that show that Wattpad is intensely anticipating and often driving, it seems, contemporary fiction like Colson Whitehead, specifically along vectors of how do you tell a story about racial objection, and all the trends, again, are beginning in Wattpad and diffusing outwards.
Wow.
So yeah, I think, and again, I think if you're a true believer in culture and democracy, you're like, of course, like that's just, but again, having data to support it is powerful.
To me, it's not obvious at all that let's say that the populist Taurus is tugging the elite cart, but there you go. Wow.
I wanted to piggyback a little bit on something Simon was asking about earlier about sort of these new users coming in who are less interactive with the entirety of Wattpad, and that this is sort of something we see especially with the COVID stories. Thinking a little bit about the sort of sociological importance of your finding, one way to think about this, and I'd be curious, sort of what your take on this is something that struck me is you've got people who are coming on this website, they don't really want to interact with the community. They just want to post content, and that content, especially when it's about COVID, they just sort of want it out there. And then there's a sort of loneliness to that that's kind of reflected in the structure of the story and the structure of the narrative. But at the same time, they do want to put this stuff out there. They're not sort of writing it on their word processor and then just having it become, that draft of a novel that so many of us kind of have in our Dropboxes that isn't getting shared with everyone. Can you speculate a little bit on sort of what's driving that? Maybe, sort of sociologically or psychologically. It's a very interesting, I think, phenomenon. It's great that we have a sort of record of it already from your work, but I'd be curious if you could speculate more on sort of what do you think is going on there?
Right. So something I forgot to mention, and I'd have to double check, but we created an indicator variable to control for users that joined after COVID and users that are kind of long-term users. And I think that, to our surprise, I think that variable was insignificant, meaning that they aren't dividing into camps, like, okay, so to kind of, I think what you're suggesting is maybe people who only join Wattpad after COVID or writing the lonely stories, like they don't give it, like they don't care, and they're like kind of isolated. We don't see that effect. We don't see a lot of evidence. We see a little bit of that, but not a lot. I think it's kind of unknown. I mean, I want to point to Simon's amazing paper with Chloe on where he has this category of residents versus tourists on Reddit. I think it's a brilliant formulation. I love it. And I'm going to steal it. Well, I'm going to cite it in future work. And there's this question of, I think, this idea that residents and tourists are the kind of late joiners, residents are the hardcore people. I think those categories, at least in the Wattpad case, are extremely permeable, that tourists often become residents, residents become tourists. I can't remember, Simon, from your paper, but it's not the case in Wattpad COVID stories that tourists come in and they stay tourists. Like sometimes tourists become residents, and that's kind of cool. And we haven't modeled that effect. I mean, that's a good idea. Again, this paper is already like 50 pages long. It's like too long, but that's a really cool next thing to do, right? To see when does when does a tourist become a resident, and is there a textual signal, right? I just think like intuitively what's going on is some people join because of COVID, but they get really into it. And that fan fiction thing, then they get inspired by they read more, right? And they start adopting the norms of Wattpad, which is a lot of fan fiction stuff and genre fiction. So just, I'm thinking about a random dude, because a lot of these guys, they're posting information graphics. Some people jump on a Wattpad and be like, I have this, I just need to tell you information about how to get a vaccination shot, right? But sometimes that person sticks around and is like, actually, like, Wattpad's kind of awesome. And they're like, I came here to give you information, but I kind of now want to write a story about the Avengers and like COVID, like a Chinese conspiracy theory. But so I think that happens, but in terms of a pattern, we just haven't done that work, but it's interesting.
Cool. Yeah, because just to clarify, I remember from the presentation you're saying, you've got new users, a lot, these COVID stories more so than the general sort of Wattpad corpus tend to be written by these new users, if I recall. And then those COVID stories also tend to be written by lonely users and have these sort of lonely narrative features. But you're saying that the mediation isn't quite there, that it still feels like those three things of sort of newness and loneliness and COVID, there's still reason to think that they're relatively independent.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, okay. the way you put it, really motivates me to do some more testing.
Okay.
We just haven't done that, but it's a good way to put it, right? That these three categories, what are their relationship? We just haven't done it, but it's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Richard, this is this is like a very enormous and fun conversation. We're talking about all the science we can do, the insights we have into literature. So I want to just ruin everything. I want to ask sort of a more kind of a career kind of question, which is, you can tell obviously David and I are both thrilled by this, and I'm certain, it's really exciting stuff. There's so many questions here. How do you make this something that has an impact on people in the humanities? Is it possible to speak to people who, let's say, haven't drunk the Kool-Aid on this? How do you draw people in, or how, in this case, this might be just a good case study. It's like, how, were you able to draw people in, and how did that work? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, I actually, it's fun talking about all this stuff. We could do this for hours, and Simon, you and I, of course, do this anyways in our free time. But yeah, I actually really want to talk about.
Just be clear, Richard. Like, this is apparently coming in critical inquiry. Like, this is.
This is part of it, right? So the first thing I want to say is, when I was a student, I took a class with Matt Jockers many years ago, and I think it's fun to see people already doing this work, talking about this, exciting. But from my perspective, I also want to know, like, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to start doing research, So, it's fun to see all these people geek out to like p-values or whatever, but it's in the end not super necessarily super useful. So I'm glad to pivot this towards, right, like people just learning how to code, like how am I going to write a thing? So I would say with this specific piece, we wanted to write it for a humanistic audience. So that's how we imagined the formulations, the questions, the writing, and so forth. And yeah, based on just talking to other humanists, some journals, this super prestigious academic journal, Critical Inquiry, they're super interested in it. It's going to go straight to the board. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I think about this in two ways. One, yes, there should be like a core question of interest to the even most traditional humanists. So pandemics in literature, that's a thing. Literature and representation, that's a thing. And also just the history of technological changes and cultural representation, that's a huge part of the humanities as well, like Kittler, McLuhan, stuff like that. So we saw this work as directly, squarely in literary studies as the history of representation, pandemic literature, technology and writing, stuff like that. So we were pretty unconcerned about reaching our colleagues in the humanities just because we're two pretty skilled humanists who do this kind of work a lot. And you play with it, to see what speaks to people. But the other thing I want to say, though, is a little bit more of a pushback on that, which is increasingly I get excited about this work because it can be so broad and impactful. So there's also just this test of, is this just generally interesting? Do people in general care about this? Which I think humanists should care about that. And if they don't, then I think that's a problem with the discipline, less of our problem. So how are people telling stories about this massively important thing? Humanists should care about that because we care about the work of writing, literature in relationship to social crisis and change. So there's also that we were most excited about this project because like people care. Like at the dinner table with some regular people, they find it interesting. So humanists should find it interesting. The last thing, I find it also important that if you're going to do this work, you should feel comfortable introducing some alien ideas to push the discipline. So we get drawn into like cog science stuff because we start talking about human behavior. Modeling human behavior is not really a thing that we do in the humanities. Thinking about why do humans do something, right? We think about why do writers write about stuff, but like why do humans do things? But to me, I want to get into that because humanists should think about that. That's a really interesting question. In fact, I think to me, the most interesting work happening in the academy is understanding why do people do stuff, right? And to me, if humanists still want to get involved in that question, that's their problem. That's not my problem. I mean, it's just, I want to think about that. And I believe that if you do good work, people will come around to it, right? So I think partly, as you're suggesting, you do need to package this work very smartly to deal with central concerns of discipline. If you do that, then you have some leverage to start then, backdooring some other just broadly interesting stuff. But again, increasingly, because of the power of these methods and the scale of the work, I'm mainly driven by, is this generally interesting to people? Everybody, not just people who care about literature. So that's what really drives me.
Yeah. All right. That sounds great. I thought that's a great, place to end it, Simon, in terms of, thinking about for the audience of this course, thinking strategically about how to get into this kind of work and how to think about yourself as a scholar doing this kind of work. And, for me, as a philosopher, the more interested I get in this, I think, Richard, you just summed it up so well by saying, this is about why people do stuff, but it's specifically about why people do cultural stuff. An economist or a sociologist might be interested in, why people tend to become, why more people might choose to become accountants than plumbers or something. We're interested in why people choose to write novels, why people choose to make culture. And I think that the study that you presented in your lecture and then we talked about in this Q&A is a really great example of how you can use computational tools to investigate this kind of ultimately the most important question of sort of why culture even exists and why it exists in the way it does and changes over time. So I think that's all fantastic, and it's really just grateful to you for sharing your expertise with us and sharing your research with us, and answering our questions. So yeah, I know you provided your information in your lecture for people taking this course. I hope people will reach out to you because exactly as Simon said, there's an important dimension of this, which is how do you start doing these same kinds of projects in your own way and bringing your own skills to bear on it. So I hope you've inspired some people out there today, because certainly it's been great for us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.